this presentation. I have heard him once before, and he was absolutely spectacular, so I think you're all in for a treat to hear Professor Mendelsohn. He's the director of the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies, and he teaches as an associate professor of history at the University of Cape Town. He's also authored The Rag Race, How Jews Sowed Their Way to Success in America and the British Empire, which won the Best First Book Award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society and the National Jewish Book Award on American Jewish Studies. So for all of you who are with us tonight, so just a brief explanation of the format of this evening. Professor Mendelsohn is going to give us about a 30-minute presentation. Then Doron Klein, Telford CEO, is going to speak for a few minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for about 20 minutes of questions and answer sessions for people who want to relate to any of the points that we've brought up. So without further ado, I'd like to call on Professor Mendelsohn.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction, and lovely to have such an international audience in Israel and elsewhere. I mean, including I looked at those who are here, including people all of about a kilometer away from me here in Cape Town. So it's in what's left of our lockdown. It's lovely to see familiar faces and unfamiliar faces as well. So as was described, I am the director of the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Cape Town. And one of the things that the Kaplan Center does is to conduct research on South African Jewry. That's really our mandate, is to do a whole variety of different types of research. Some of it is historical, some of it is also sociological, looking at patterns within the community today. And over the last now 3 decades, we've conducted a series of studies, roughly once every decade, sometimes more often, looking at what's happening in the community. So really getting a snapshot of the community at particular moments in time. And the first time we did this was in 1991, again in 1998, in 2005, and we completed a study earlier this year. So we did the field work last year and finished the analysis earlier this year. So I'll talk about what that study shows, but also to talk about some of these trends, what's changed over the last 3 decades since really the first time we did a study of this kind. And as you'll see, the study tracks a whole variety of different areas. We look at demography, so what's happening in terms of the population of Jews in South Africa. We also look at questions of identity, so in terms of how Jews identify religiously and otherwise. We look at education, so trends in terms of attendance of Jewish day schools and things of that kind. And also we look at religion. So again, this I suppose relates to identity, but we look at what's happening in terms of practice, in terms of observance, in terms of affiliations of Jews in South Africa. And tonight I'll talk about just a handful of findings from this study. It's a very large study, and we worked on it for several years. And there is those of you interested, there is a report which is easily available. If you look at the first slide, you should be able to see this. The cover of the report, the report is available on the Kaplan Center website. So if you type in Kaplan Center UCT and you click on surveys, you'll be able to read this report. As I said, it's an extensive report, covers all sorts of topics I won't have time to talk about this evening. My goal, however, this evening is really twofold, 2 objectives. Firstly, I would like to discuss some of the trends that we've identified in terms of what's happening within the Jewish population in South Africa. And as I said, look at how things have changed over the last 3 decades. And then more than that, also to look at what are some of the long-term ramifications of these changes. In other words, what can these trends perhaps tell us about the future, potential futures of Jews in South Africa? What directions is the community moving in? And as I said, I'll just talk about a handful of areas. There are all sorts of other trends which also speak to the potential developments within the population, which I won't talk about. In essence, tonight I'm going to talk largely about demographics and about immigration, and then also a little bit about religion as well. And you'll see that a lot of this speaks to questions about what's likely to happen in terms of of the future of the community. So the first theme, the theme I'll start with is, as I said, demographics. So what's happening in terms of the population, in terms of its numbers, in terms of age and things of that kind. So one of the major findings of this report is that we estimate that the Jewish population of South Africa is now a little over 52,000. We estimate that it's 52,300. So if you look at slide 2, this is exactly what it shows. That you can see that the largest number, around 30,000 we estimate, are in Johannesburg, followed by Cape Town with around 12,500, and with Durban quite a lot smaller. So in fact, yeah, that's the correct slide. So this number is not particularly popular among some leaders of the South African Jewish community. That it created quite a stir when word got out that this was our estimate. Why is this number unpopular? Well, the community is now half the size, actually less than half the size than it was in the early 1970s. At its height, the South African Jewish population was slightly over 120,000. Now we are well short of half of that. So we now are 52,300 or thereabouts. More than that, it's also less than half the size of the Australian Jewish population. And for a long time, South African Jews prided themselves on being larger than the Australian Jewish population. Until relatively recently, the Australian Jewish population was smaller than that in South Africa. Now these two communities are moving in opposite directions. The Australian Jewish population has grown, the South African Jewish population has shrunk. Another reason why this number is not particularly popular is that the South African Jewish population, if we're to be realistic, is probably not that far off from falling below 50,000. And that to me, I think is quite a psychologically significant milestone once the community is smaller than 50,000. But to me, this number is consequential. It matters that there are 52,000 Jews in South Africa, but it's not particularly surprising, not particularly interesting, in fact, because the decline in the size of the Jewish population has been underway for decades. For those of you who are living outside of South Africa, living in Israel or elsewhere, you know this very well. South African Jews know this very well as well, that the community has shrunk because of the direct and indirect consequences of immigration. Direct consequences, people living abroad. Indirect consequences, people having children abroad and not having their children in South Africa. So again, the community isn't growing because of that, people have left, and they typically leave when they are able to have children, or at least a significant number leave when they are relatively young, and therefore their potential future kids are born elsewhere, not in South Africa. As I've said, there have been abundant signs over the last decades that this has been underway. In fact, the last accurate population number we have of the South African Jewish community is from 2001, which showed that there were probably about 70,000 or so Jews in South Africa. There are lots of signs then that the community would continue to shrink. So therefore, as I said, to me, there's little surprise in this number. It reveals what we already know, that the South African Jewish population is much smaller than it was when we last had reliable data, which is in 2001, and will likely continue to get smaller as well. The supposed good news is that South Africa remains the 11th largest Jewish population by country in the world. So South African Jews we haven't fallen since the early 2000s in terms of where we stand globally. The bad news, the only reason why we remain the 11th largest Jewish population in the world, is because our peer communities, other Jewish communities, have seen exactly the same process, that the same shrinking has happened elsewhere. We've stayed at number 11 because the countries which are next in line, numbers 12 and 13, are the Ukraine and Hungary, and they've not been particularly friendly places for Jews in the last number of years. So in other words, what we're seeing here is a broader process. What we're seeing in South Africa is not distinct to South Africa. Instead, the South African pattern speaks to the latter stages of what really has been a fundamental change in Jewish demography, which has been underway for decades. A once dispersed and truly global people has become a people concentrated in a handful of countries. So in other words, we've seen this process over decades now of consolidation, where today only 5 countries in the world have more than 200,000 Jews. only 2 countries in the world have more than 500,000 Jews. And this is, again, very, very different from a century ago. Certainly even different from what the Jewish world looked like after the Holocaust. But this is a process which South African Jews are experiencing and which world Jewry is experiencing too. Australia is actually the outlier here in terms of not shrinking. Obviously, Israel is the other major outlier as well. So what do our numbers tell us about the direction that South African Jewry is heading? Because as I said, the total number of Jews has declined, but that's only part of the picture. Another part of the picture is that the median age, the midpoint age of the population is 45. This is old in comparison with the median age of the general South African population, that the average South African is 26. The average Jew is 45. The midpoint Jew is 45. And here, absolutely, this is the right slide to look at. But much like the national Jewish population figure, focusing only on this number conceals more than it reveals. And this is, you can see here what the population pyramid looks like. As we'll see, there are actually more complicated dynamics at work when it comes to the demography of the community. For one thing, the median age of the South African Jewish population, that midpoint age, is only 1 year older than that of the Australian Jewish population. Again, what this points to is that Jewish communities around the world, with few exceptions, are getting older. The Australian Jewish community has grown because of immigration, not because, again, of native-born Australians necessarily having more children. Our country, South Africa, the population has shrunk because of immigration. What we see on the surface with the median age of the community and this population distribution pyramid, which I'm showing you over here, is an aging demographic profile that is typical of many diaspora Jewish communities. You can see that this population pyramid doesn't look like a pyramid. It should, a healthy population should look like a pyramid. Here it doesn't. Instead, it almost looks like an inverted pyramid. What that tells you in large part is, again, the effect of immigration. You can see that particularly those in the age bands in the 30s and 40s and 50s, there should be more Jews in South Africa. They aren't here. They are instead living in Israel and America and the UK and elsewhere. So it's, again, the effects of immigration, but also the effects of a community which is aging, where over time, over decades, family sizes have decreased. So people are having fewer kids. And the effect here is one of a naturally declining population as well. But here too, we need to look beyond the surface. Looking at the median age of the entire South African Jewish population in an undifferentiated way is problematic. So if you just look at this table, you actually are again getting a little bit of a distorted picture. What is much more revealing is what happens if we look at different parts of the country. Because one of the trends I'm going to talk about again and again this evening is that there are different trajectories, different trends in different parts of South Africa. That there are major differences. There's a divergence between Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban. The median age, just to give you an example, in Cape Town and Durban is significantly higher than it is in Johannesburg. That the Jewish population in Johannesburg is younger on average than in Cape Town and Durban. While the national median age is 45. So that's if we put all Jews in South Africa together, national median age is 45. If you just look at Cape Town, the median age is 52, so above that average. And it's even higher in Durban. Durban is a particularly old community in contrast with Johannesburg and even Cape Town. Now, again, illustrate this in another way. If you look at those aged between 18 and 40, so again, a younger age band, and you compare this in these 3 cities, in Durban, 7% of Jews are in that younger age band, or between 18 and 40, 7%. In Cape Town, 16% are in that younger age band. But in Johannesburg, 30% are in that younger age band. So you can see that Johannesburg is a much younger community. It's many more young Jews than does Cape Town, and certainly many, many more than does Durban. And there are all sorts of implications of this, which you can imagine. What this means is that Johannesburg's reality is different from that of Cape Town and Durban. Johannesburg is less top-heavy than Cape Town and Durban. It's more likely to naturally replenish itself. All those people aged between 18 and 40, they again are, if they stay in South Africa, they are likely to have families and have kids who will naturally replenish that Johannesburg Jewish population. That's not going to happen to the same extent in Durban, and the same is true in Cape Town. In other words, we might do better here if we think more about communities in South Africa rather than of a single Jewish community. We talk about Jewish populations rather than a Jewish population. And what we're going to talk about is how these different centers are pulling in different directions. It's not just a story of demography, of age profile, and of size. There are all sorts of other trends going on in Johannesburg and Cape Town and Durban, which are actually very, very different and are pulling these communities apart as well. So if Cape Town and Durban need to worry about a population that will naturally decline in size, Jews in Johannesburg are more likely to say they want to immigrate. And if you go to slide number 4, you'll see this reflected. And this is another one of the data points from the survey that has received a lot of attention. So slide number 4 is of, the next slide is of immigration, of people saying that they have thought about immigrating over the past year. Our study finds that 43% of Jews say they have considered leaving South Africa permanently in the last year. That's an immensely high number. 43% of all Jews say they have thought about leaving. This is a shocking number, on the face of it at least, that so many people have thought about leaving the country. And this is even worse if you go to the next slide and you break this down by age. And you can see that younger people, particularly those in their 20s and 30s and 40s, are much more likely to say that they have thought about leaving. And again, the implications there are potentially very, very serious for the community, because these are the people that you need to sustain the community over time. These are the people that both sustain it financially, but also these are people with perhaps the time, energy, and maybe one day the money to keep communal institutions going as well. So this is, as I said, another figure which received a lot of attention when our study came out. But we need to place this in some perspective, because in 1998, so one of our previous studies, we had a similar percentage who said the same thing. So 41% then said that they had considered leaving, considered immigrating in the previous year. But what's interesting about that 1998 number, 41% then who said they wanted to immigrate, is that in the years afterwards, the rate of immigration actually declined rather than went up. So in other words, it's the predictive value of people saying that they've thought about immigration doesn't necessarily mean that people necessarily will immigrate in the years ahead. I think what it tells us a lot about is sentiment towards South Africa, that when we did the survey, and we did most of the field work, as I said, we did the field work last year, we interviewed lots and lots of people last year. When we did that, sentiment in South Africa was really very, very bad. And that's what we're picking up here, that people, because things were so bad, they've thought about immigrating. This was not the only question that we asked about immigration. If you go to the next slide, you get a sense of another question that we asked as well. Because in addition to asking respondents, those we interviewed, about whether they had considered leaving, we also asked about whether they were likely to immigrate over the next 5 years. So this is a question about action, not about thinking. This is about, are you actually going to put your thoughts into action? And 15% of those that we polled, it's still a very, very large number, indicated that they are likely to leave South Africa over the next 5 years. And again, I can put this in perspective again, in our previous survey, particularly the 1998 survey, again, we had very significant numbers who said that they plan to leave. Not all of them did so, because again, as anyone who's thought about immigrating knows, and anyone who has immigrated knows, it's difficult, it's challenging. There are all sorts of costs and benefits that people have to weigh up, and often the thinking about it and even planning doesn't necessarily translate into action. Nonetheless, this is still a very high number. What has changed over the last 2 decades, so since 1998, is not just how many people have said that they might want to leave or have thought about leaving or plan to leave. What has really changed, and this to me is very striking and of interest to those of you sitting in Israel in particular, is that the number of people who say that they plan to move to Israel has gone up dramatically. So I'll give you an example. In 1998, 33%, so a third of those that we spoke to, said that they were, those who had said that they were likely to leave South Africa, said that they wanted to immigrate, not to Israel, but to Australia. Australia was the preferred destination in 1998. It was also the preferred destination in 2005. 31% said that they preferred to go to Australia. That was a top pick. Israel lagged behind, as did America. Israel and America were in a lower percentages. So in 2005, 21% of those who said that they were likely to leave said that they preferred Israel. In this new study, the study that we completed earlier this year, and you see this in that slide in front of you, what's so striking is that now 51% of those who say that they are likely to leave in the next 5 years say that they want to go to Israel. And now Australia and the US trail far behind. And that's a very, very striking change. And we can talk about why, or at least why I believe this has happened a little bit later. What's also interesting here, when we asked everyone about their long-term plans, not about the next 5 years, but their long-term plans, another interesting thing, which again reinforces this data, is that of all the people we spoke to, roughly just under a third said that they would like to settle in Israel at some future point in time. So again, Israel as a destination has grown in popularity dramatically over the last 2 decades. That it's now more popular than Australia and the US, and by a long shot. It's a very, very striking phenomenon. And likewise, as I said, even those who don't plan to immigrate in the next 5 years are thinking about Israel too. So there are several other findings, just to move on from immigration, several other findings in our study that interrelate with this immigration issue. And I'll speak briefly about several of these, as again, they point to changes in the profile of the community and also changes amongst those who are likely to immigrate as well. So what are the other very striking trends and changes since the 1990s is the degree to which the community has become better educated. In little more than 20 years, so really since that 1998 study, the percentage of the Jewish population that has a university degree has more than doubled. Again, very, very striking for this to happen in a short space of time. In 1998, 35% of the total population had university qualifications. Now more than 60% hold bachelor's degrees or above. And what's really happening here is that an older generation who are less likely to have university degrees have died in many cases, and those who are younger are much more likely to have university degrees. So those who are aged between 30 and 39, 76% of them, so more than 3/4, have a university degree. So it's again this interesting internal shift within the community. And this has all sorts of implications for the community, implications in terms of income within South Africa, but also in terms of immigration as well. That university degree advantages Jews when they immigrate to countries which have a points-based or merit-based immigration system, and makes Jews more competitive for jobs internationally, but also jobs in South Africa as well. So again, this is one of these interesting and quite dramatic changes in a very, very short space of time. Other findings relating to education are equally striking. And here, if you go to the next slide, you will see exactly this. Already in 1998, 3/4 of school-aged Jews were already attending Jewish day schools. So again, here we go. So 75% of Jews in 1998, of Jewish kids, were going to Jewish day schools. What's interesting is that number has actually held steady since 1998. We found the same number in 2005, and again now when we did this study. What has changed is that in 1998, this was a new phenomenon that had accelerated in the preceding decade. So in other words, if you did the study in 1991 or before 1991, you would see that many, many fewer Jewish kids went to Jewish day schools. And even more important, that their parents, many few of their parents had gone to Jewish day schools as well. In 1998, this is a relatively new phenomenon. In other words, the parents of kids who were sent to Jewish day schools in 1998 were much more likely to have matriculated from government schools than parents with kids in Jewish day schools today. So what's happened is that those who were kids in the 1990s are now adults. That cohort and the ones that have followed are now in their 20s and 30s and 40s and have kids of their own at Jewish day schools. So what this is a very convoluted way of saying something which is relatively simple, which is that in other words, the proportion of the Jewish population as a whole that has gone to Jewish day schools is now much, much higher than in 1998. In 1998, relatively small percentage of the Jewish population had gone to Jewish day schools. Now a very significant share of the Jewish population has gone to Jewish day schools. Because this is a knock-on effect over time. So what has the long-term effects of this been? So of having now 3 decades at least, if not more, of a very significant share of the Jewish population going to Jewish day schools. I'll give you one example. The percentage of the Jewish population in South Africa which claim to be able to speak Hebrew has gone up dramatically. In 1998, 13% of the entire community said that they could speak Hebrew. Today, 24% of the community say that they're able to speak Hebrew. 54% say that they're able to read Hebrew quite well. Whether this is true or not, I cannot tell you. What's even more interesting, if we go to the next slide, is that self-reported attachment to Israel has increased significantly since 1998. So this is the next slide. You can see that attachment to Israel is incredibly strong. And this trend is not because of education alone, but there's strong evidence that this change in schooling pattern, that a greater proportion of Jews having gone to Jewish day schools, has actually had the significant influence over how attached Jews are to Israel. And this is a surprising finding, that attachment to Israel has actually grown stronger over time. And this is surprising because to follow the South African media, South African news, and all the attention which is placed on BDS and the general hostility towards Israel and towards Zionism in South African politics and South African public life, you'd expect that perhaps attachment to Israel would have gone down, would have declined over the last 2 decades. Instead, there's actually evidence of the opposite, that attachment has grown stronger. Perhaps some of it is in response to the sense that to BDS and anti-Israel action in South Africa too. But a lot of it relates to Jews having gone to Jewish day schools. Another impact, another effect of this higher rate, this higher proportion of Jews having gone to day schools is seen in the intermarriage rate. If you go to the next slide, you'll see this there. The high rate of Jewish day school attendance has played a key role in keeping the intermarriage rate very low in South Africa over the last 2 decades. It's barely moved over the last 2 decades, and significantly lower than Australia and the United Kingdom, and particularly the US. There are all sorts of other trends I can talk about as well. Let me talk about one of them quickly. I see that I'm beginning to run out of time. Another very interesting trend relates to religion and how the community has resorted itself in significant ways when it comes to religion. If we go to the next slide, you'll begin to see exactly this. And we see this change both in belief and in affiliation. And so, for example, I'll talk about belief first. So in 1998 and 2005, we asked the same questions. We said, do you believe that the Torah is the actual word of God? And roughly 1/3 of Jews said that the Torah is the word of God. When we conducted the survey again, the percentage is almost double. Now close to 60% of Jews in South Africa said that the Torah is the word of God. Equally interesting is what happened to those who said in 1998 and 2001 that the Torah was inspired by God, but not actually the word of God. In 1998, 41% of Jews said, oh, the Torah is inspired by God, it's not necessarily the word of God. In 2019, so when we did the survey last year, 14% said that it was inspired by God. So in other words, what we're seeing happening is a major change in belief within the community. And you'll see it reinforced in a second when I talk about the practice as well and affiliation. And this is an indicator of trends that have been visible for more than 2 decades. Those of you who know South Africa well, know Johannesburg in particular, you've seen this happening over time. Parts of the community have become much more orthodox in both belief and affiliation as well. And I'll give you some numbers which back this up. So in 1998 and in 2005, 14% of Jews describe themselves as Orthodox or strictly Orthodox. Today, 38% of Jews describe themselves as Orthodox or strictly Orthodox, so more than doubled in less than 15 years. On the other hand, those who are not Orthodox are trending in the opposite direction. So as part of this phenomenon, the self-description that was most popular in 1998 and 2005, traditional, has collapsed. And in 2005, 2/3 of Jews in South Africa describe themselves as traditional. Today, less than 1/3 describe themselves as traditional. So we've seen this interesting polarization taking place, with some people becoming more Orthodox and lots of people becoming much less traditional in terms of how they see themselves and what their practice is as well. And we see this, by the way, in terms of everyday observance too. So, for example, these previous surveys we asked about, do you fast on Yom Kippur? Do you attend a Pesach Seder? Do you participate in a Shabbat dinner? And in all those, when you ask those questions, in every single case, more than 90% of people said yes, that we fast on Yom Kippur, we attend the Pesach Seder, we participate in a Shabbat dinner on a regular basis. What's interesting, again, we asked these same questions now, and one of the answers that we got, significantly lower for all of these questions. So now 53% say that they regularly attend Shabbat dinners. Roughly 3/4 say that they fast on Yom Kippur. Pesach Seders remain popular. 81% say that they attend Pesach Seders. But again, then, if you just look at the national figures here, the story is misleading. This is a story, if to really understand this, you need to look at demographics. And if you go back to the previous slide, you'll see exactly this, that younger people are more likely to self-describe themselves as religious than their grandparents. You can see how those at the bottom of the table, those who are younger, are much more likely to identify as Orthodox or strictly Orthodox than their grandparents do. Also, if you go to the next slide, what you'll see is that this is not just a story about demography, it's also a story about geography as well. If we compare those three cities again, compare Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Durban, Jews in Johannesburg are much more likely to answer questions about belief and identity affirmatively than Jews in Cape Town. In other words, Jews in Johannesburg are much more aligned with the Orthodox movement and Orthodox practice than Jews in Cape Town. And if you look at this table in particular, it's a very interesting one. It's worth paying some attention to. You'll notice how Orthodoxy dominates in Johannesburg, that 48% of Jews in Johannesburg describe themselves as Orthodox. And if you combine those with those who describe themselves as traditional, 79% of the community describe themselves as traditional or Orthodox. Compare that with Cape Town, 22% of Jews in Cape Town describe themselves as Orthodox. And you see this again in the next slide. And if you, by the way, if you look at Durban, you see very much the same trend as in Cape Town, just more so that Durban, again, there is a striking balance in Cape Town and Durban between Orthodox and progressive Judaism as well. So again, this interesting polarization taking place. What this points to, again, is communities rather than community, that there's this period, we're seeing a period of polarization and resorting that is undoing what used to be a middle-of-the-road consensus among South African Jews. Again, even as recently as 20 years ago, most Jews answered these questions that, as they said, we are traditional. We're somewhere, we're not quite Orthodox, but we are certainly that way inclined. Now, a fascinating shift in exactly this. And all this, I'll speak very briefly about in a moment, all this has potential implications for the community. Let me just end with a final theme that's unfortunately very relevant to the present as well. And this relates to the economic profile of the community, a very different theme from the sort that I've talked about up until now. So for a variety of reasons, the South African Jewish community has a strikingly high rate of self-employment. The Jews have done well since 1994, largely in self-employment, not in government service, not in working for large corporations, although some Jews have done very well working for large businesses, but often in self-employment has been crucial to the success of South African Jews. So when we asked the survey, and this is actually, we see this in our previous data as well, 26% of Jews in South Africa who are, 26% of Jews who are older than 18 in South Africa are self-employed. A very, very high number, because remember that adult Jews in South Africa, a significant share are also retired. So of the working age Jewish population, an even larger percentage, proportion are self-employed. So this has never been a source of concern until now. The Jewish community in South Africa has actually done very well because of self-employment. But given the current crisis we find ourselves in, because of the impact of COVID and the economic lockdown, this is suddenly a matter of great concern, as is, of course, the top-heavy age profile of the community. The former challenge can be acted upon, in other words, and has been acted upon. There are all sorts of initiatives in South Africa to try and help Jewish small businesses. There are free loan schemes, there are a variety of other measures which have been adopted, but the implications here are potentially very serious for the community if the damage is as serious as some people believe. Because it's not just a case of more people needing aid over time, needing welfare over time, but also the community's ability to pay for itself, to support its own institutions, is potentially undermined as well. That if its tax base, if its communal tax base declines, which unfortunately it looks like something which will be very likely. In fact, one of the things the Kaplan Center has done over the last couple of months is we ran a survey trying to understand the economic impact of the epidemic, and we are releasing that data next week. And again, it's not particularly pretty data, but again, it points to the impact of the pandemic. We don't necessarily know whether this will be whether the community will bounce back or be able to bounce back. We plan to run the same survey again in a few months' time to see what's happened in the interim. So what this all means for South African Jewry is uncertain. We don't know, for example, whether when it's possible for Jews to immigrate again, for South Africans to leave the country again, there's going to be a wave of immigration. We know at the moment there are travel restrictions, so immigration has effectively ended. Will we see an acceleration of immigration once immigration becomes a possibility again? On the one hand, fewer people might have the means to immigrate. It's more difficult to get into a variety of countries where Jews want to go. Israel, again, might be even more attractive as a destination because it is, again, it continues to be welcoming of Jews. On the other hand, as I said, Jews might, we don't know what will happen in South Africa. Maybe there'll be a recovery. We'll see. Maybe those of you who saw the economic figures from earlier this week can see that South Africa's been hit very, very hard by the pandemic. The decline in GDP has been, the GDP has declined by 16% in the last quarter. So all this points to something we know about South Africa already. All this data I've pointed to. That there's never a dull moment for South African Jews. I suspect, however, that 2020 is a hinge year for South Africa and its Jewish population. If I was to give this talk in 5 years' time, I suspect that the future of the community will be a lot clearer. I think we are at this moment of uncertainty where there are these long-term trends which are playing out, but also the effect of the pandemic will likely accelerate some of these trends too. And I've given variations of this talk in a variety of different places, and I've spoken, for example, earlier this year to an Australian audience. I joked to them that maybe if I give this talk in 5 years' time, we'll all be doing it in Sydney. That's where we'll find the South African Jewish population. But I think in reality, talking to Telfed, in reality, looking at that immigration data, is perhaps more likely that we'll be doing this talk in Israel. Thanks to everyone, and I look forward to your questions later.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating, Professor Mendelsohn, and we really appreciate the time that you've given to us here at Telfed and to our audience to be able to learn about the situation in South Africa today and to see the impact also it's going to be having, as you said, on Israel and on Telfed. So I'm going to take 5 minutes now to talk about Telfed, and then we're going to move over to questions. So people will be able to write their questions on the Zoom group chat, and I'll read out the questions, and then we'll ask Professor Mendelsohn to relate to them. So as Professor Mendelsohn said, we're looking at 51% of South African Jews saying they're going to be coming to Israel, and really, as you finished your talk, makes Telfed very relevant to the South African Jewish community. The Telfed's been around since 1948, and since the beginning of the state, when we were looking after the Machal soldiers who came to volunteer in the War of Independence, we have been looking after the South African Jewry here in Israel and making sure they have a successful absorption. And for that reason, we have a very strong organization with very strong professional staff. We have a full-time Klita advisor that deals from pre-Aliyah to post-Aliyah, the whole Klita process, the absorption process, and that's Ad 120, until age 120. We are helping people throughout their lives here in Israel, their children and their grandchildren. It actually goes down 3 generations. We have a full-time social worker. Telfed today supports over 400 needy South African Olim every month. During the COVID crisis, that's gone up to 450 needy olim every month, and that amounts to over 2.5 million shekels a year in financial aid, and also social work and social work counseling. We have a full-time employment advisor who is a life coach and also a career counselor to help people find jobs in a difficult time. In Israel also, as in all over the world, unemployment rocketed. And people really need our assistance in designing their CV, finding jobs, and we're there to give them that advice. Scholarships, Telfed gives over 500 scholarships every year. There's scholarships based on financial need, scholarships that have a volunteer component of 3 hours a week that our students volunteer to help us absorb olim. And those scholarships can give the students over 8,000 shekels a year. So it's very significant when it comes to paying their tuition. We're the only Ole organization in Israel out of the 23 Olim organizations. We're the only one that provides housing. Telfed has 105 apartments in Tel Aviv and in Ra'anana, 3 buildings. And those apartments, we subsidize the rental up to 30% below market rates. And 70% of the rental income goes to help the needy. So if I spoke about before us helping between 400 and 450 needy olim every month, a significant amount of that money is coming from the rentals, the subsidized rentals that people are paying for staying in our buildings. And please God, we're now planning to build a 4th building. And that building will provide more income so that we can support needy olim. Please God, it will be in the near future that we'll be building our 4th building. Events, we have approximately 90 events a year with over 5,000 participants in our events. Now all of those events are virtual, just like this evening. But that's the way we keep in touch with the community here and overseas, as is happening tonight. And it's a great way for people to stay connected, both to Telfed and to one another. And volunteerism. Telfed is based on volunteers. If I spoke about each one of those departments with a full-time staff member, each one of those departments has got a very strong committee of volunteers, starting with Batya, who opened the evening this evening, our chairman, and with 250 volunteers in Telfed, helping a staff complement of 14 staff members. Without those dedicated volunteers, the organization would not be able to run. And this is a time for me to actually say, if anyone would like to volunteer and get involved with helping us absorb olim and arranging events and being a mentor for a new Ole. So please be in touch with us so we can help you join our ranks of the volunteers. So everything that I've described now about the organization has led the Israeli government to give us 2 awards of excellence over the last few years. And you would expect that after getting 2 awards of excellence, we'd also get a significant amount of our budget supported by the government. But out of the Telfed budget, less than 1% of our budget is government support, right? So we have to look after 99% of our budgets, and 1% comes from the Israeli government. So we are a registered non-profit tax-deductible entity. So I want to ask everybody here tonight to please remember Telfed, remember the South African olim that we are assisting down to the 3rd generation. And when it comes for you to make your Rosh Hashanah donation, please keep us in mind for your tax-deductible donation in Israel. You can donate via our website. It's very simple. You can dedicate cards there to send to your loved ones. So please do so. And if you look at the chat, you'll be able to see our website address over there. So I want to thank you very much also for listening to me. And we're now going to move back to Professor Mendelsohn with the questions that people have sent. So I'm going to read out the questions, Professor Mendelsohn, and if you could please give your response. So the first one I'm looking at is from Martin Graham. So Martin wrote as follows. He wanted to know what the population trajectory is over the last 40 years. What's the percentage of the eligible population that are gainfully employed? What's the projection of the South African Jewish population in 2030, in another 10 years from now? And he wanted to know if you have data for the number of South African Jews that are currently in America, England, Australia, and Israel. So Israel, I can answer. That's quite easy because we have that data. There's 23,000 South African Jews made that up since 1948. And those are the official numbers. The other people that perhaps are not into that, let's put it this way, the maximum number of South African Jews is 20,000. So between 23 and 25,000, the official number is 23,000 since 1948. I'll hand over to you, Professor Mendelsohn, for the rest of Martin's questions.
Sure. So a series of very interesting and important questions there. So the first question was about the population trend really over the last 40 years. And as I described to you, we have fairly good data from the 1970s onwards. And certainly, so what happens in the 1970s, 1980s is that Jews are recorded in the census. In other words, we have census data which you can use to track the Jewish population. And the Jewish population is, my memory is that it's in the early 1970s, I think 1972, it's about 123,000 at its height. And then, with the predictable effects of political instability in South Africa, so at particular moments in time, you see spikes of departure. So you see, departure in after 1976, see significant numbers of departures in the 1980s, and again in the early 1990s as well. So and we can track this, using census data. It becomes more difficult after 2001. The 2001 census has an opt-in question about the Jewish population. So in other words, you have to choose to identify on the census, you have to choose to fill out that question. And the data we got back from the 2001 census is very difficult to interpret, because suddenly there were, I think, around 120,000 Jews in South Africa. We look at this data more closely, what it demonstrates is that a lot of Black South Africans were describing themselves as Jews. These are not necessarily members, the Lemba and others. We've actually seen this phenomenon elsewhere as well. There's a certain percentage who like the idea of thinking about themselves as Jews, and they aren't in any way connected with the established Jewish community. So we after that 2001 census, spent a lot of time trying to work out how many of these are actually traditional Jews in South Africa, or members of the established Jewish community. And there's a range which is offered in by a number of different scholars, but in effect, most people agree that they're somewhere between 70 and 75,000. If you're an optimist, you say they're 80,000. If you're a pessimist, you say they're 70,000, but somewhere in that range. So you can see that trend over time. The immigration accelerates, particularly in the 1980s. That's at the time when we see a very, very high rate of departures. Again, no surprise that it's connected with the political situation in South Africa. But you can see the trend line clearly over time. And as I said, it tracks political issues in South Africa. Just as an aside here, again, there aren't any good immigration statistics about Jews leaving South Africa, except for actually from Telfed and from people who are carefully collecting this data. The American Jewish community, we don't have a good source of data. We don't have the same from the UK or Canada. That we've worked out ways to get at those numbers. And what another, again, indicator of what's going on with immigration is something which the Kaplan Center does. The Kaplan Center has the records of Lithuanian immigrants who came to South Africa. We have shipping records immigrant records from early in the 20th century. What has this got to do with immigration from South Africa today? Well, one of the things we track is how many people come to us and ask for Lithuanian immigration records because they are applying for Lithuanian passports. And again, that very closely tracks people's sentiment about South Africa today. So we see a spike of people who want to get Lithuanian passports when they feel very unhappy about South Africa. Okay, but that's an aside. What percentage of the population is gainfully employed? Good question. I don't have a perfect answer for you offhand because again, it varies quite dramatically city by city. But again, because of the age profile of Durban, that it has a larger population of retirees than does Johannesburg, proportionally a larger population. The same with Cape Town. Cape Town is also larger proportion who are retirees and therefore are not working. But I can, if you're interested, that data is actually in the report, and I can follow up later and give you an exact number. In terms of what I expect the population to be in 2030, again, I unfortunately, well, I won't say unfortunately, I'm a historian, but historians are very, very bad at prediction. We make very, very poor profits. Look, my sense is that the immigration trends have been in place for a long time. That the trend and the fact that there are so many South African Jews abroad makes it that much easier for people to leave. It means that you have connections, networks. You probably visited family in Israel and elsewhere, and that psychologically makes it that much more easier to leave South Africa. So I think that immigration is a bit like a genie, that once the top of the bottle is open, it's very, very difficult to put that stopper back on the bottle. So in other words, I don't think immigration is likely to disappear. It will continue. Whether the rate goes up or down is less clear. And I think, again, that so much is uncertain in South Africa and so much is uncertain in the world at the moment that, if South Africa defaults on its debts, which, the fiscal position of South Africa at the moment is dire. If that happens, we might have an Argentinian-like situation. There will be a sudden exodus of Jews. Lots of Jews left Argentina to go to Israel in the late 1990s. We might have that. But on the other hand, South Africa has a habit of bumbling through problems and again, defying the doubters. Maybe things will improve, will stabilize, and in which case there won't be a radical change. But I do think, as I said, both because of the existing trends towards immigration and also because of this aging population profile, ultimately this community naturally is just going to get smaller over time. It's not going to disappear for all sorts of reasons, but it naturally will be smaller. So again, if and when we do a survey in a decade's time, I expect it to be, well below 50,000. What exactly it will be is less. In terms of the current Jewish population elsewhere in the world, so Israel, again, there's good data. We came up with quite clever methods to estimate what the Jewish population is in different places. So you can, if you look at this at census data from Canada and Britain and the US, there are ways to actually read that data to work out, not from the US, you can't work out who's a Jew in the US because there's no religion question, but you can work out from the Canadian census and the UK census who is Jewish and also who arrived and settled in Britain or Canada in a particular point in time. So we have actually very good estimates for each of these countries. Our estimate for the US is 40,000 South African Jews living in the US, so a very, very large number. Our estimate for immigration to the UK and Canada and Israel over the between 2001 and 2015 is just short of 16,000 people. So very significant numbers who have left. Again, I can give you an exact number for Australia, or at least our estimate for Australia and for the UK. I don't have it on hand at the moment, but just a final thought about this, which is useful for you to hear. We now believe there are more South African Jews outside of South Africa than inside South Africa. So again, that just tells you a lot about immigration over the last decades.
Thank you very much, Professor Mendelsohn. The next question is relating to the Zionist youth movements. What was their impact? What are the statistics that you have that relate to the Zionist youth movements and their impact on everything that you've shown us this evening?
Okay, so it's a very good question. So I'll give you the honest answer, which is we have lots of data on this. We just haven't analyzed it thoroughly yet. So such as the realities with a very large survey is that we began by focusing on a handful of subjects. We still need to get to really focus on what the changes in youth movements has been. And again, to speak about some of the preliminary investigations of this, they reinforce what we already know, which is there has been a shift over time in terms of affiliation, in terms of youth movements, and it is city-based as well. So for example, Habonim now draws much more heavily from Cape Town than it does from Johannesburg. And this again reflects the increasing religiosity in Johannesburg, that the affiliation with B'nai Akiva in particular is much stronger in Johannesburg. What we will want to do is to track that and to look at older data as well to see what impact this has in terms of immigration patterns over time as well. So in other words, if you are a member of Habonim or B'nai Akiva, are you more likely to say you want to make Aliyah, or you're more likely to say you want to immigrate somewhere else? Those sort of questions we haven't yet done that work on them. Again, what's interesting is a resilience of these movements over time. Is that they remain very popular. Again, how they will do at the moment with the pandemic is less clear. I was asked to speak in December at one of the youth movement camps, and I think that now they have to work out this difficult question: what do you do? Obviously, it's a question lots of people are asking. What do you do? Can you hold a camp with the given the circumstances? I think the answer at the moment is no. So, Doron, you're silent, still muted.
Yeah, thank you. Cynthia Barmore asked if your numbers include Israelis living in South Africa, because there used to be a sizable Israeli population in South Africa, and that would change the statistics.
It's a great question, and we spent a lot of time thinking about exactly this issue, because our sense was that Israelis that are less likely to affiliate with the community, with the established community, less likely perhaps to send their kids to Jewish day schools. We're less likely to catch them, therefore, then we don't want to miss them. Our objective here was we spent a lot of time and effort at identifying Israelis, and our sampling method again took this into account. But what's interesting with that is one of the things that our survey points to, and this unfortunately I think points to a broader trend within South Africa, is that the Israeli population has not increased dramatically. In fact, in some places like Durban, it seems to have fallen significantly. And to me, what this really suggests is the impact of an economic crisis in South Africa, which has now been going on for more than a decade, is that Israeli immigrants are often economic immigrants, people in search of opportunity, and South Africa has not been a country of opportunity for at least, it's been a country of diminished opportunity for the last decade. So the Israeli population has not grown significantly. And more than that, we were expecting the Israeli population to be less affiliated with the Jewish community than it is, than the broader Jewish community is. And I think one of the interesting trends that we've seen is that with the decline, for example, in public schooling in Johannesburg and certainly the growing popularity of private schooling across the country, that a higher percentage probably of Israelis are now sending their kids to Herzliya, for example, in Cape Town, than we might have expected. So again, this, for a variety of reasons, the Israeli community in South Africa is probably less separated from the broader Jewish community than it once was, for all sorts of reasons. Probably also because of, again, that sense of broader hostility that people sense in South Africa against Israel, that might have also led to a greater sense of solidarity between Israelis and South African-born Jews.
So relating to the educational system, so can we assume that the increase in Jewish children attending the Jewish schools is to be attributed to the deterioration of the educational system in the government schools? And can we relate that to the rise in anti-Semitism and the rise in anti-Israel feeling in South Africa that was being a critical and pivotal reason for many of the changes that you've described?
Okay, it's two very good questions, interrelated questions. So certainly, when you look at Johannesburg in particular, that the rise of Jewish day schools and the proliferation of Jewish day schools, I mean, the diversity that there now is in terms of Jewish day schools in Johannesburg, and the variety of religious options which are available, the day school movement has exploded over the last, now it's more than 2 decades. And it's part of a broader process, particularly in Johannesburg, of a flight from not just schools, not just from public schools, but also from public services generally. I mean, to me, it's part of the general trend where Jews in South Africa now you have private security, you go to private hospitals, you use private schools. It's this privatization of the state for people who are middle class. So I think that's part of the broader trend. And also in Johannesburg in particular, it is interconnected and with the growing religiosity of the community as well, that if you're more religious, you're more likely to send your kid to a Jewish day school. So that's part of the story. And also, I think that there's a question of norms here as well, of commonly accepted practice. And I think that sending your kids to Jewish day schools became the norm in the 1990s. So it's, and for partly for the reasons I described, but also, people who themselves might not have gone to Jewish day schools, once their friends began to do it, it became something which was socially acceptable, something which was the done thing to do. So again, all these reasons are important. Whether it relates to anti-Semitism is, to me, less clear. One of the, again, striking, something I didn't speak about at all this evening, is this question of anti-Semitism. And there we find very striking data that compared with, again, our peer communities, if compared with Australia and Canada and the UK and the US, that rates of anti-Semitism, both in terms of reported incidents and people's experience of it, what they've told us about it, are much, much lower than elsewhere. And this is despite the anti-Israel sentiments which are expressed openly on television and in the press and elsewhere, that we haven't seen a significant uptick in anti-Semitism. And again, there are all sorts of theories about why this is the case. And some of it probably relates to the fact that, well, the community is relatively small and is relatively invisible today. As a Jew in South Africa, you're much more likely to feel uncomfortable as a white person than as a Jew. Again, so in other words, anti-white sentiment and it might override anyone's recognition that there are Jews in South Africa, or lots of Jews in South Africa. And this, by the way, relates to something the Kaplan Center did now a few years ago. We did a big survey of Black attitudes, the attitudes of Black South Africans towards Jews. And what came out clearly from that is that Black South Africans, for the most part, know nothing about Jews and are largely oblivious to the South African Jewish population. We asked, by the way, also questions about Israel there, and the vast majority of Black South Africans don't know or think or care anything about Israel as well. Very, very small minorities either care about Israel or are hostile towards Israel. Most people, they're very parochial, focused on South African issues. And so I think, again, that probably explains why anti-Semitism is a marginal factor. We asked people, by the way, how do you identify a Jew? And everything they told us was basically identifying Muslims, not identifying Jews. So again, it tells you that Jews are invisible to most Black South Africans.
So there's just two last questions. One of them I will like to relate to, and the last one, Professor Mendelsohn, I'll give to you. The question was that if a mass aliyah, like we saw from Argentina, were to occur, does Telford have the means to deal with such an aliyah? And what could ex-South Africans in Israel and around the world do to help? So certainly if we were talking about an aliyah of tens of thousands of people coming at once to Israel, so Telford itself would turn to the Israeli government. This would already become something that will become a government project together with the Jewish agency. We wouldn't do it alone. As with all the mass aliyah from around the world, it always becomes a government issue too. And actually, if we look at the mass aliyah from the former Soviet Union, actually was dealt with by Telford. The first 500 olim from the former Soviet Union came through Telford. And once we settled those first 500, we handed over the project to the Israeli government and the Ministry of Absorption. So that big aliyah from the former Soviet Union started with Telford. So we have had experience with mass aliyah, and we can handle it, but we would certainly do it in partnership with the Israeli government, and they would have to give us more than 1% of our budget, if that were the case. So how to prepare for it? We are preparing for it. As I said, we're planning to build our 4th building in order to provide more housing. And since it's 70% of the rental income from the buildings goes to help the needy, you can see that we are preparing ourselves for a bigger aliyah from South Africa and also a more needy aliyah from South Africa. But if the situation would be a mass aliyah, we would certainly bring the government and the Jewish agency on board. And the last question, which I'm giving over to you, Professor Mendelsohn, is, are there any aspects of the survey that surprised you?
Thanks. I mean, those are both very interesting questions. And I'll just say that about this mass aliyah, I'll speak about that just for a second. And I think you've pointed to the right factors that if there is a mass aliyah, that it'll probably mean that things in South Africa something has changed dramatically in terms of the probably economic position for Jews. It's more likely to be an Argentinian situation than a sort of sudden anti-Semitism. But it's unlikely to be tens of thousands of people immigrating, just because there aren't tens of thousands of people left in South Africa. Our numbers are now, we're close to 50,000. And I'm not, at the same time, I should make clear that it's unclear to me that there is likely to be mass immigration. I think it's immigration, at least, and unless there's a profound fiscal crisis in South Africa, that immigration will continue at the sort of rates we've seen, that it's sort of a steady number every year, and it goes up and goes down year by year, depending on what's happening in South Africa, rather than a mass once-off exodus. I mean, that's possible, but I don't see that at the moment. But again, things can change. In terms of what surprised me, so all sorts of things surprised me in the survey. To think about one in particular, I suppose let me put it this way. I'll talk about a trend rather than a particular data point. One of the things the survey explained to me is why we're now seeing conflict in the South African Jewish population community to the degree we didn't see even a decade or two ago. That there have been quite ugly communal fights over certain issues. That there was an issue in Cape Town, and I don't think it's an accident that happened in Cape Town, over singing by women at the Yom HaShoah ceremony. This was a few years ago. There have been other things of this kind. There was again a quite public and nasty spat over Jewish students at Herzliya taking the knee during the playing of Hatikva. I think, again, very controversial things of this kind. And one of the things that the survey data to me explains is we are seeing a period of not just immigration and of other forms of change, of aging in the population. We're also seeing an intense process of polarization as well. Again, I didn't speak much about attitudes towards Israel, but we have data on this question too. And in all sorts of areas, when it comes to politics, when it comes to religion, Jews in South Africa, and in some ways, are catching up with Jews elsewhere. That this used to be a community which liked to think of itself as having a middle-of-the-road consensus opinion about a variety of matters, that we described ourselves as traditional. We like to think we got along about all sorts of matters. And I think one of the things which is happening is that the center is collapsing, and instead we're following Jewish communities all over the place in polarizing on all sorts of issues, polarizing on religion, polarizing on politics, and polarizing in other forms of identity too. And this to me explains that we're in for I think a rough few years. The community is in for a rough few years in terms of intra-communal relations, in terms of the community just getting along. That I think we instead there's going to be lots more fighting amongst South African Jews over the next number of years. And as I said, it's not one data point, but multiple data points to me that points to this. That we used to think about South African Jewry perhaps as a relatively happy community. I think it's, for a variety of reasons, there's likely to be unhappiness within the community over the next number of years.
Thank you very much, Professor Mendelsohn. And I'd now like to hand over to the Telfed chairman, Batya Shmukla, to give thanks and to conclude the evening.
So firstly, I'd like to just apologize about the microphone at the beginning. I've changed my microphone. I'd just like to say a very big thank you to Nikki Levener, who's from the Telfed Resource Development Department at Telfed. And she was instrumental in facilitating this evening. So thank you very, very much to Nikki for that. Also, we really were very honored to be able to host Professor Mendelsohn. This is actually the second time I've heard him speak, and every time you speak, I learn something new. So really, thank you so much. And thank you for so many people joining from all over the world. It really is very special for Telfed to be able to host an event like this, especially during such difficult times. And I really encourage all of you to like our Telfed Facebook page, look on our web page, and keep in touch with us. If you'd like to volunteer, please be in touch with the office. It really is a very special organization, and I don't get paid to say that, so I really mean it. And I hope you all have a good evening and a Shana Tova in good health. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Batya. Thank you, Nikki. Just a question about the recording. As you could see, Nikki very kindly recorded this whole session for us. So a few people asked about the recording, and it will be available on the Telfed website, so if people want to watch it again and recommend it to other people. Also, since we have those people that registered, we do have your email addresses, so we can also send you, let you know where you're able to find the link. So thank you very much. I'll utilize this time to wish everybody a Shana Tova. Thank you to our chairman, Batya Shmukla, and to all of you for joining us. Laila Tov.
A final word just before we end off. I will email people also the link to the full report, which is available online, a 109-page report with the rest of the information. And I think the biggest thanks go to Professor Mendelsohn, who kindly gave of his evening to present all of this information. I've had emails already pouring into the inbox from people around the world saying thank you, how very much they enjoyed it and how fascinating it was. So we very much appreciate you giving up the time. We look forward to possibly hearing about the new report that you're releasing on the economic effects of the virus, and possibly even developing a closer friendship and working relationship going forward. So special thanks and appreciation to you and your family, Shana Tova, and to everybody else who joined us. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Laila Tov.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.